coming by the thousands.
When we began to go to Mississippi, the black people we met there were not interested in lunch counters. They weren't interested in sitting in the front of the bus. There were no lunch counters. There were no buses. They wanted to vote.
It'll be carrying registered voters. It'll be carrying registered voters.
I just made up my mind that I was going to be a registered voter. I never wanted to be a politician. I just wanted the right to vote.
I don't want the Negro as I have known him and contacted him during my lifetime to control the making of the law that controls me, to control the government under which I live.
I don't think people understand how violent Mississippi was. Terrorism led black people to the obvious conclusion. If they try and vote, they're messing with white folks' business, and they can get hurt or killed.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 students from all around the country who will engage in what we're calling freedom schools, community center programs, voter registration activity, and in general, a program designed to open up Mississippi to the country.
The burned-out station wagon in which the 3 civil rights workers were last seen has been processed by FBI laboratory investigators.
I knew it was going to be bad. I didn't dream for a minute that people would be killed. But it was always in the back of everybody's mind that bad things were going to happen. So it was terrifying. But if you cared about this country and you cared about democracy, then you had to go down.
I'm going down to Mississippi. Oh, I'm going down a southern road. And if you never see me again, remember that I had to go. Remember that I had to go.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a militant group in the South with support from other major civil rights organizations, is readying a massive program called the Mississippi Summer Project, a campaign that may have no parallel since the days of Reconstruction.
I'd heard about Mississippi all of my life growing up. But nonetheless, the fact that the people in Mississippi couldn't vote was just a shock, even to me there in Memphis. I thought that it was very important to go to Mississippi and make a statement about the horrors that confronted black people there.
This Ivy League campus is one of the staging bases for an invasion of Mississippi by college students. The students are being recruited all over the United States from Harvard to Hawaii. They will go to live in Mississippi this summer to fight for the Negroes' civil rights.
I first heard about Freedom Summer in the spring of 1964. I saw a brochure on the bulletin board at Drake University, where I was a student, which is in Iowa. And it just caught my eye immediately.
I had been making drawings for corporations and colleges, and my wife, June, felt very deeply about the injustice in the country, as did I. So we decided that I would take my skills as an illustrator and go to Mississippi. I was 20 years older than they were, but I was part of the group.
My job was recruiting. Students heard about the project, either through me or the campus newspaper. Then they contacted us for an interview and for an application.
I'm a junior at Queens College majoring in anthropology. My schooling so far has been oriented toward history, and I have a good knowledge of current affairs. Finally, I have a good deal of experience with racial and religious prejudices in the North and South. Andrew Goodman.
I have just returned from a spring project on a voter registration drive in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I was filled with an overwhelming desire to clean the rot out of America. All I can say is that it's very important to me that I play my role in civil rights for the U.S., and most of all, for myself. Linda Wetmore.
We were looking for people who believed that this was important, who would be respectful to the Black community, who were not nutcases, who were not divas, and who were not people who were going down to show the world how great they were. This was a majority Black organization, with Black people telling white people what to do.
Now, Phil, let's say you're in Mississippi, and Bob Moses, who's the director of the project, comes over to you and says, Phil, will you spend the next 4 weeks typing index cards or some other task that you might not care for very much? What would you react? How would you react to that?
I would certainly say yes, but I do hope that I can participate more actively in the movement. If this is where he wants me to be, of course, that's what I'll do.
We turned down people. There were many more people who wanted to go. But from the point of view of safety for the whole project, we had to have people who were as together as you can be when you're 19 or 20.
When we were sure that Freedom Summer would actually happen, Jim Foreman, the executive director of SNCC, sent a number of people who would be paid field staff into Mississippi to help pave the way.
Part of the application process to be considered as part of the field staff was to write a letter of application. And this is part of the letter that I wrote. I wish to become an active participant rather than a passive onlooker. As my husband and I are in close agreement as to our philosophy and involvement in the civil rights struggle, I wish to work near him in whatever capacity I may be most useful. My hope is to someday pass on to the children we may have a world containing more respect for the dignity and worth of all men than that world which was willed to us.
For these students, it will be a longer, hotter summer than for almost anyone else in this country. But they believe their project will be the breakthrough in the civil rights battle. Their motto, crack Mississippi and you crack the whole South.
From an early age on, I was told as a young Black boy, if you see white people walking down the sidewalk, especially if it's a man, you step off to the side and drop your head until he passed by, because if you didn't, he might consider that to be disrespectful, and he might hit you, he might kick you, he might beat you.
My grandfather, he would take me with him downtown Hattiesburg to pay bills. And I remember my grandfather wore a straw hat with this colorful blue band around the hat. And as a white person approached us on the sidewalk or crosswalk, he would tip his hat in what I would call an extra show of deference. And by the time my grandfather and I reached back to his house, we had bowed so many times to white people. They taught young kids like myself how to play the role of that second-class citizen.
There are a lot of phonies who will stand up and tell you that, oh, well, all are equal in the eyes of God. How silly can you get? Christ himself was the greatest teacher of segregation.
Mississippi really stood like an island of resistance. There were only 6.7% of blacks who were registered to vote prior to Freedom Summer, compared to 50, 60, or 70% in other southern states. Most of the rest of America didn't seem to care, and that's what Freedom Summer was about. If we bring white students and black students from all over the country, then everyone will pay attention to Mississippi. We'll bring America to Mississippi because America is not paying attention to Mississippi.
In the 50s and 60s, particularly in the old plantation agricultural areas of the state, African Americans made up at least half, and in some cases 70 or 80% of the population. And in some counties, of course, there was a realistic understanding that if black people voted, they probably would be electing black officials. A lot of white people thought that African Americans in the South would literally take over, and white people would have to move. They would have to get out of the state.
I was born in Mississippi, and I'm the product of a society in which I was raised. And I have a vested interest in that society, and I, along with 1 million other white Mississippians, will do everything in our power to protect that vested interest.
There was no Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi during this early period. There wasn't any need for one. The Citizens Council was doing everything that the Ku Klux Klan would have done. There were a lot of prominent people who were members, businessmen, bankers, lawyers, politicians. I joined it because I believed in what they were doing, and I believed in trying to preserve the society in which we live.
This is the Citizens Council Forum, the American viewpoint with a Southern accent.
The Citizens Council was really running the state of Mississippi. It was part of the whole apparatus of a white supremacist society, that you had the local police, you had the registrar, you had everyone involved in the Citizens Council. They succeeded in preventing almost all blacks who attempted to register from registering to vote.
Political participation was something reserved for whites. And if blacks sought it, they could get hurt in lots of different ways, ranging from economic reprisals, loss of jobs, or if you had a business, restrictions or being placed on your business, or if you had a loan, your loan being called in.
The common theory about Mississippi was that you could not attack Mississippi from the inside. It had to be attacked from the outside. You had to stand away and say, this is an awful place and it ought to fix itself. But Bob Moses and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee said, no, that's not true. We can do it ourselves.
Bob Moses was a high school teacher in New York City. He went south in 1960, originally just feeling he had to go, had to get involved. SNCC sent him to Mississippi. He started going around on his own in the rural areas where people simply didn't go and challenge the status quo.
What made him stand out was not only his sheer courage, but his calm courage. I can't tell you that Bob Moses was afraid because he never showed it. He just went about his work, and there was this calm sense of mission.
Bob went over there by himself in 1961, and by the end of 61, maybe there were 5 or 6 SNCC people in the state. In 62, maybe there were 18, 19, and in 63, maybe there was 23, 24. When we'd have a staff meeting, we all could fit in one little room.
Young people working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as we call it, are characterized by restless energy. They seek radical change in race relations in the United States. Their world is upset, and they feel that if they are ever going to get it straight, they must upset it more.
I don't want anybody to think that we were a bunch of really brave Negroes running around Mississippi. That's not what we were. The reason that SNCC, as it were, opened up the Delta is we were young and foolish. We didn't have the very complete understanding of what that risk was. But what impressed me was that there were black Mississippians who did know how dangerous it was.
Well, we met this cadre of older people who had been fighting. They were eager for our help and glad we were there.
They knew that the key to unlocking Mississippi revolved around the vote. And the access for black people to power at that time has got to be through the vote. What was useful was that I was open and accustomed to listening.
What we were trying to do was to organize these communities to take possession of their own lives. For the last 100 years, the ability of black people to control their own destiny had been taken away from them.
Hi. Hey. All right. I'm Idell Kraft, and I'm working for the Board of Registration here.
When I got hooked up with Bob Moses, it was very simple. You go out through the community, you knock on doors, talk to people.
The only way to better your life, better the lives of your children, to go down and register to vote. If you're not a registered voter, you're not a first-class citizen.
We would tell them that if they registered and voted, they could elect the sheriff, and that the intimidation on the part of the sheriff's office and his deputies, they could change that. One of the things that I always tell them is that we could stop Mr. Charlie from lynching us.
You're sitting on front porches, or you're walking out into a cotton field, or maybe you're at the juke joint having a beer. What we were doing was embedding ourselves in these communities.
You have your certificate showing that you are a registered voter.
They haven't given it to me yet.
Well, you aren't a registered voter, mister. We want you to come down to the courthouse tomorrow.
Immediately, what you found out you were dealing with was fear.
So why not go tomorrow? We will furnish your transportation. So that's no excuse.
They would say, "You're right, boy. We should be registered to vote. But I ain't going down there to mess with them white people."
Would you like to go to both of these morning phone places?
No.
We did not get a large number of people to try and register to vote. And then within that small group of people who did try and register to vote, very few of them actually got registered to vote.
Other people are standing in the courthouse. We can't see why we have to stand out here in the rain in order to register to vote. Denial of our constitutional rights.
Your section of the Constitution that I choose for you is number 48.
The registrar had total control over who was accepted and who wasn't. The voting form was one of the most complicated you would ever have, and as part of that, each person would have to interpret a section of the state constitution.
We had people who taught in colleges. We had people with PhD, master degrees, and all, and they couldn't pass. You had to be white.
No, Jennings, you didn't pass. If you see there, you didn't fill out, but just look there. You just filled out that part, and look, you didn't write anything in there. You didn't pass it.
Sometimes a sheriff would walk into the room while they were taking the voting test and say, "Annie Mae, don't you work for my mother-in-law? My mother-in-law would be horrified if she knew you were taking this test. Now, Annie Mae, I'll tell you, if you'll just put that paper down, I'll tear it up and I won't tell my mother-in-law.
In some counties, when people went in to register, why their names would appear in the newspaper the next day. That could have recriminations for all members of their family. It could mean they would lose their job. There were real consequences to taking this risk. It wasn't simply that you would go down and get turned away.
On August 31st, 1962, we had 18 people to register. Everybody went into the registrar's office, took the literacy test, came out, and as we were leaving the city, the bus was stopped by the police, and the driver was arrested. Everybody on the bus was afraid. And then after a while, there was a little smooth song, you know, Paul and Silas bound in jail had no money for to go their bail. And somebody said, that's Fannie Lou Hamer.
I went down the 31st of August to try to register. And after I had gotten back home, Mr. Marlowe told me that I would have to go down and withdraw my registration or leave, because they wasn't ready for that in Mississippi. And I said, Mr. Marlowe, I'm trying to register for myself. So I had to leave that same night.
She has this confrontation, then leaves the plantation and comes into Ruleville, and eventually becomes someone who is a SNCC field secretary.
One of the important things about recruiting Fannie Lou Hamer was her ability to move people. Fannie Lou Hamer brought a new kind of spirit into the movement, and I think it kind of rejuvenated all of us.
I've been tired a long time in the state of Mississippi, living in the county with James O. Easton, the senator, Senator Stennis, that go to Washington and tell the people that the people of Mississippi, the Negroes, are getting along good and we are satisfied. But I want him to know this, both of them, we are not satisfied, and we haven't been satisfied a long time.
We've been accustomed to men standing up and challenging the movement, but here is a woman, a black woman, and her message to us was, don't give up. Freedom is not free. Keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting.
As SNCC became more active in the Delta, the Mississippi Delta, where Greenwood is in the heart of Leflore County, we started to create visibility around voter registration, and people started going to the courthouse. People tried to vote. They would push them off the land, so they had no place to live. They took away their homes. African-American people there who had small businesses, the banks called their notes.
Even though there were very few people being brought down to try and register to vote, the white power engaged in an act of reprisal directed at the entire black community. What they did was shut down the commodities program. What it was government surplus food that was sent to poor rural areas. The county officials said, well, no, we're not going to have that, which is essentially put black people and poor people in a position where they could starve during the winter. And this was an especially bad winter.
I just keep wondering how they're going to eat and what they're going to wear, because they have no money, they have no food, and they have no clothing. They have no way to buy food and clothing. We have appealed to people all over the United States to send food and clothing in.
What would happen next would eventually reshape the direction of the movement in Mississippi. Dick Gregory was then a big-time comedian, flies into Greenwood, Mississippi in his own chartered airplane, full of food to meet the need as a result of this cutoff of commodities.
Dick, how much food did you bring with you on this trip? We brought something like 14,000 pounds on this trip here. Canned food, milk, baby food, cereal, wheat, flour, sugar, potatoes.
You had the news media coming in. And soon these pictures were going out all over the world of what was happening in Greenwood, Mississippi, where several months before it had been very much of a small operation with little visibility at all.
City officials denied a winter-long cutoff of food allotments was retaliation for the Negro voting drive. But the sharecropper who tries to register to vote often faces the threat of losing his job and being put off the plantation. Bob Clark, ABC, Greenwood, Mississippi.
It shows us that it's possible to make the country pay attention to Mississippi. Gregory's action indicates to Mississippians that they didn't have to be alone.
The American people only see what's on television at night in the evening news. So where Dick Gregory created a lot of drama and the cameras were there and then it went away, we wanted to figure out how to do that for an entire summer, to invite the children of America into Mississippi so that they pay attention to what's going on in Mississippi. And from that, the Mississippi Summer Project evolved.
Most of the organizers in Mississippi were opposed to the idea of the Mississippi Summer Project, which meant essentially bringing down, I think the number we were talking about was roughly 1,000 students. I was one of the people who was opposed to Freedom Summer.
People in the movement were willing to die, but we didn't want to die in obscurity. So if we brought in students, their colleges, their parents would focus on Mississippi. I supported bringing the volunteers in.
The experience of people like Mrs. Hamer was that people coming from the outside was a good thing. Mrs. Hamer backed me up into a corner and said, "Well, Charlie, I'm glad you came. What's the problem with having more people come? How can you be opposed?" And eventually, we decided to go ahead with Freedom Summer. Once the decision was made to have a summer project, there's a series of meetings and discussions going on then about what the summer project is going to do.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a militant group in the...
Well, there were three components of Freedom Summer. One was voter registration, which would be going door to door, knocking on doors, and asking people if they were willing to go down to the courthouse to register to vote. A second and very important component of Freedom Summer were the Freedom Schools. They would teach things that were not taught in black schools in Mississippi. Black schools in Mississippi couldn't teach about black history. They couldn't teach about black literature. So Freedom Schools were set up to do exactly that. And finally, there was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It was a parallel political party which basically said that we will send our own delegates to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City at the end of August, and we will challenge the all-white delegation to see who would represent the state of Mississippi at the convention.
White Mississippians believed that what was going to happen in the summer of '64 was something that not only they had to be psychologically prepared for, they had to be militarily prepared for it as well. It shows you the hysteria that was evident in much of white Mississippi.
In Jackson, Mississippi, a city of 100,000 whites, 50,000 Negroes, the mayor has prepared for this summer's activity by increasing the police forces, by passing new ordinances against demonstrations, and by purchasing a steel-plated vehicle, a riot control car known locally as Thompson's Tank, named for Mayor Allen Thompson.
We are prepared to take care of any law violations, to keep down violence.
In addition to Thompson's Tank, armor-plated and equipped with 9 machine gun positions, the arsenal includes cage trucks for transporting masses of arrested violators, searchlight trucks, each of which can light 3 city blocks in case of night riots.
The Citizens Council had convinced people that the Klan wasn't necessary, that it was bad publicity, and that they could keep schools from being desegregated, they could keep lunch counters from being integrated. But by 1964, when they see the Volunteers for Freedom Summer, it was clear that they couldn't. And that's when the Klan starts to ride.
The Klan rose up as one in Mississippi. One night in April of 1964, crosses were burned all over Mississippi. They claimed that they had 90,000 members and they were going to resist what the Klan called the nigger communist invasion of Mississippi. So Mississippi, on the eve of Freedom Summer, was on a hair trigger.
There was very much a recognition and a debate about, is it responsible to bring all those kids into the state, most of whom are probably far too naive to understand what they were getting into in terms of the violent nature of the place. Are you doing this to use people as fodder? The thought was, well, you know, we'll do this orientation at Oxford, Ohio, and we'll try and tell these kids what they're getting into and make it clear that they really don't have to go. But, you know, I don't know that that really could begin to prepare people.
My grandmother said, we've heard that you're planning on doing something really crazy, going to Mississippi with those SNCC folk, and I'm never going to permit it.
We went to Oxford. A group of us from Massachusetts met in Boston. We drove across, sharing, driving, you know, for different hours. We drove straight through, people sleeping. I know I drove very fast.
Several of us drove up to Oxford in the blue station wagon that we used in Meridian.
With my grandmother, my mom and dad pleading, threatening, I just said, I'm leaving. A girlfriend drove me to the bus station, and my grandmother's parting words were, if you leave, don't ever come back.
I remember one young woman saying, we're going to settle this problem, and then it's on to the Indians, and we're going to settle that too. I mean, there was that kind of unbelievable idealism.
I can remember people saying, well, how bad can it be? You know, because they had no idea. And even I didn't think that they might be beaten or killed. And in fact, that was one of the ways that I sort of calmed my fears. I thought that their presence would be a mediating factor.